Thank you. Okay, thank you everyone for taking your afternoon to be with me, and it's a great pleasure to be here in Norrköping. So this is work that I've accomplished with my co-author Grégoire Claudieu, and he is based in Grenoble in France. And this is work that's been recently accepted at ASQ, and so we're very happy about the outcome there. And so I'd love to make this a conversational time that we have together, and so feel free to ask questions either of clarification or if you want to push an idea either about the concepts that I'm promoting and the arguments that I'm making, or about the context itself. Feel free to do that, and I'd love to engage with you at any level. So this is a story, as Grégoire and I have talked about. It's a love story that we're presenting here, and it's a love story about a group of actors, amateurs, who really loved what they were involved with in a particular activity called radio broadcasting. And our setting is in the emergence of the radio field in the United States at the turn of the 20th century for about 30 years. And this was a very intriguing period in the history of the US from a social standpoint, a technological standpoint, and economic standpoint. And radio is one invention that came on the scene at that time period. There are many others that took place, but we're going to be focusing on radio broadcasting in that era. To set the stage for the conceptual ideas that are coming out of our study, I want to begin with several examples to kind of give some flavor to what we're working on. Imagine different occupational groups that exist in our society. You have doctors, for example, who become qualified typically by going to a medical school, a prestigious one if they can, and then they go through a period of training and they become certified by taking exams that have been administered and overseen by the respective boards governing that particular practice. And this kind of certification process occurs in a variety of occupations. Not only doctors, you have accountants, or architects, or engineers, teachers, faculty. We all go through this process so that others can recognize us for being experts in a domain of knowledge. And that's what the professionalization process allows as a result. That those who belong to a profession, who have completed this course of study, can be considered experts in that area. Now I want to contrast that with some other examples that don't quite fit this neat formula, but yet in the end they've achieved or attained a level of expertise and have become recognized for it in the broader field. Let me give you another example. There's a website here called Planet Hunters with this title, "Are you ready to discover new worlds?" with a tagline at the bottom, "Zooniverse is a collection of web-based citizen science projects that use the efforts of volunteers to help researchers deal with the flood of data that confronts them." And so if you go into this website, not only can you help discover new planets, but you can get involved with a variety of other citizen science projects in science, with respect to astronomy or natural sciences, weather and nature and botany, even history or biology. And the intriguing part of this is that the professional scientists are asking everyday individuals who have some interest in these scientific fields to come join them and work with them and help them understand the data that they're analyzing and the scientific questions that they're pursuing. Again, this seems a bit non-standard, to the point where this individual, D.M. LaCourse, whose affiliation is an amateur astronomer, jointly published a research paper with a number of other professional astronomers and scientists about their explorations of outer space. And in this particular study, Planet Hunters X, They were studying this particular region of the nighttime sky, data that they've gathered from the Kepler Space Telescope. And they're looking for variations in images in this particular region, and those variations would represent the potential for planetary activity in that part of the space. I also want to point out that this is not some, substandard exercise, that the publication appeared in the monthly notice of the Royal Astronomy Society. Has anyone heard of this or published in this outlet? I haven't, so I took a look at this particular journal, and has a pretty decent impact factor, and it's one of the top-tier journals in the astronomy field. Again, you have this amateur astronomer working alongside with these other scientists, doing real science, benefiting the scientific field. One last example. This gentleman here, Salvatore Iconazzi, is an Italian, I think he's a computer programmer. And one day he went to his doctor and received a diagnosis that he has brain cancer. And he asked his doctor, can I get more information about my diagnosis so I can process this and make sense of what to do? And he heard from his doctors the following: doctors, start speaking a language which you don't understand and which is not really meant for you to understand. Representing this divide between professional doctors who are in control of dispensing medical knowledge from those patients who are expected to simply receive them. What did he do about it? He said, well, I want to take matters into my own hands. And as a computer programmer, he was able to take the film and the images and the scans that his doctors created for him, put it onto a website, and then he open sourced his diagnosis. And he asked for people around the world to give him advice. And he received over 500,000 hits and submissions, everything ranging from quacks and those who didn't have anything substantive to add to those who really had some sound advice for him. That image in the back is a histogram of the different kinds of advice that he did receive and the distribution in various categories that he created. Eventually, he took the advice of one of those who responded and underwent a treatment that involved some surgery and other things. And I believe he has been fully cured of his ailment. But the point here is that he didn't stay with the traditional professional advice of his doctors, but found a way to circumvent the diagnosis that they gave and created his own set of treatment. If you look throughout society, both now and in the past, you have all these other examples in which the professionalization way of developing expertise and being recognized for it doesn't really apply, and that explanation doesn't really hold. We talked about citizen science. You can think about history buffs who look into the past to gain some knowledge. Whenever there's a disaster or a major news event, you could go online and read about all of these amateur detectives who are trying to figure out what has happened. You have do-it-yourself communities, and you have open source programs that have their own set of communities online typically, as well as meeting in person on a regular basis, exchanging ideas and information, and by doing so, creating a base of knowledge and expertise around which and from which others would recognize that their level of excellence. And so what we're doing here is we're questioning whether this professionalization theory actually holds in all cases. So in kind of a nutshell, our research question is as follows: how do non-professionals become recognized as legitimate experts in a field? Right? And in the subsequent slides, I'm going to kind of unpack each part of that equation here so that we can have a fuller understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. I want to introduce kind of the focal actor in our study, which are amateurs. And if you look at the definition of amateur, it comes from French and Latin, meaning to love. But it has an interesting set of definitions, and there are three of them. Number one, the first being someone who's just devoted or an admirer of an activity or a subject area, or an ardent follower, an enthusiast. Secondly, it could be someone who engages in a particular pursuit, study, science, or sport as a pastime, as a hobby, something that they do for fun rather than for work or a full-time endeavor. And then lastly, it can also be known as someone who's not really good at something, in contrast to those who are skilled, the professional, right? And so what we do is we take these three definitions and use the contrast that's built into them to help motivate the essence of our study. So as I mentioned at the beginning of our presentation, we look into these questions using the context of the early radio field in the US. And this is a time when amateur radio operators worked and played and operated alongside professional radio engineers and other actors. And initially they were considered pranksters and nuisances, causing trouble. And I'll get to that in a few minutes. But in the course of about 30 years, they became praised and lauded and turned into experts in the field, sitting alongside those same engineers or policymakers that were looking at them with scorn and disdain. And the question is, how did they achieve that conversion in that period of time? So to summarize the key points of our study, how do actors become recognized as a legitimate field expert? We're looking into a process that challenges the traditional and conventional thinking in professionalization theory. We study this in the US radio field. And then lastly, we propose as our main contribution an alternative pathway, what we're calling lay expertise legitimacy. So just so that we're discussing these points using a common language, I wanted to define some terminology that we use in our study. Number one, this idea of expertise, and comes from work by Andrew Abbott, simply as the ability to accomplish complicated tasks, formal knowledge about an activity, and it's usually referred to as work. Okay? So this isn't simply rudimentary knowledge that we're talking about. It's a higher level of understanding about how to conduct a set of tasks, an activity. Okay? Number two, fields. What we're talking about here is the standard definition coming out of institutional theory. Those organizations that in the aggregate constitute a recognized area of institutional life, share mutual awareness among participants in a set of organizations, and a common meaning system. Right? So we're not talking about a single set of actors, but multiple actors that are coexisting with some meaning system that brings them together. And then lastly, legitimacy is also an important part of our conceptual framework. We take the standard definition from Mark Suchman, a generalized perception or assumption that the actions of an entity are desirable, proper, or appropriate within some socially constructed system of norms, values, beliefs, and definitions. And so recognition of expertise can be objective by meeting a certain set of standards, if you will, or completing a course of study or passing an exam. But it can also be conferred upon actors and through some sort of process of social recognition. And that recognition comes from other actors accepting that level of excellence or that level of expertise in the focal actor. And so that's the important thing that we need to keep in mind, that it's a perception, and it's a generalized perception given to the focal actor from other actors within the field. All right, so let me get into professionalization theory and kind of give you an overview of this dominant paradigm so that it'll help us understand the differences between this paradigm or this theoretical statement with the alternative process that we are proposing. So again, Andrew Abbott, in his definition of professionalization, is the structuration of authority and expertise in a field, evolving toward a particular structure and cultural form of occupational control. And so what's important in this definition is that there's an authority structure, and it's centralized within the profession, and that controls who's in and who's out, and what is considered to be expertise and not. And specifically, it's focused on work, usually full-time, paid work, and that there's a jurisdiction, a boundary, that allows those who are in it to maintain authority over those who are not. And there's a clear division of who's in and who's out. And usually that division is a contested one, because those who are in might not necessarily adopt all those elements or standards or the approach to authority of those that are in the profession. So to Ben's point about the alternative medicine and those who might be contesting or questioning the validity or the veracity of the claims in the profession, you have this tension that's occurring at the boundaries of the jurisdiction. How do you get into the profession? Well, recall the beginning slide that I presented with the schooling, the credentials, the training, the board exams, the certification, membership in the professional associations. That's the set of guidelines or the checklist or the punch card that you need to fill out in order to become a member. In our profession, in academics, we have kind of a similar or an analogous set of requirements that allows us to become full-fledged members in the academy, finishing or getting into a good PhD program, working with an advisor or supervisor that'll train you with the methods and the skills to become a qualified academic, writing good papers and having good publications in top-tier journals and outlets gives you the prestige and the status to be considered an expert in our domain. So we can visualize this as a process diagram where you have work on one end and expertise on the other end. And this dominant model of professionalization has kind of different steps associated with it. It's full-time and it's paid activity. It's usually something that people would consider without question as being legitimate. There's formal schooling and training involved. Membership in associations and appearing in publications, and then some sort of code of ethics that governs how all of this takes place. Now, our claim, or the professionalization claim, is primarily based on a particular view of work. Work being full-time, for pay, and associated with people's economic livelihoods. And if you hold to that view only, then what we're arguing is you don't get a kind of a full picture of all the other forms of expertise that might exist in society. So if we relax that assumption about work and how work can be conducted, that opens up other opportunities or other domains in which expertise can be accumulated. For example, if you look at social philosophers, they might consider work as being labor versus other forms of work. If you look at the literature on volunteerism, there's quite a number of instances where people are really actively involved in some sort of cause, but they're not doing it for pay at all. And then lastly, there's a whole literature about engaging in activities simply for fun, called serious leisure. And these are people, some of whom really devote their time, their money, their emotional energy involved in a hobby that they truly enjoy. And then they do it in their own free time. They find others who share those same interests. They meet together to do these activities. They come together in clubs or communities or conventions or other events to enjoy what they do in their pastimes. And this one author, Stebbins, calls this serious leisure, meaning They even treat it almost like work and kind of go through the same motions even though it's supposed to be for fun. And none of these alternative forms involve any kind of credentialing process or anything formal similar to what the professions go through. So hopefully I've been able to kind of set up this tension and help you to realize that throughout society, perhaps even in your own lives or in your friendship networks, there are all of these non-professionals who are devoted to a set of activities and really good at what they do. You know, it could be wine connoisseurs or social activists or people who do things on their own, these do-it-yourself hobbyists, open source programmers who have their own code of language. If you go online on various platforms, master craftsmen. Back in time, you have polymaths and mandarins who were experts in their own domains without any kind of professional credentialing or certification to get them there. So, to kind of close out this part of the argument, you have the professionalization process, and that leads us to question, is there an alternative pathway that would also explain how work can be considered, or a group of actors involved in a particular line of work or activity could be considered experts in their field without going through this main professionalization process. Okay. All right, so the research design, we wanted to keep in mind our research question, which is about how field expertise is legitimated and the process steps involved with that. And we wanted to address 5 issues that are interrelated in accomplishing this particular goal. We wanted a setting in which professionalization could potentially occur, but didn't. And so we wanted to make sure that there's if you will, a kind of a comparative case within the case itself, within the context itself. Right? And then secondly, we wanted to make sure we had the right data sources to address this particular issue. And since our concern is about legitimacy, we wanted to be able to show the evolution of legitimacy from the beginning to a reasonable ending point. And then lastly, we chose that we decided that studying the texts representing different actors in a field, recognizing whether legitimacy existed or not, would be the best way to accomplish this task. And following other research in this particular research stream, we used content analysis, but we did this in a particular way, in an automated fashion. So let me speak a little bit about the study context itself. So it's amateur radio broadcasting, which is a vibrant field even today. Over 3 million people worldwide are involved with this hobby, talking to one another through the ether in their homes, in their garages, in their attics, in their basements. So this individual, Guglielmo Marconi, is considered the inventor of radio technology in its earliest form. There is some debate in the historical literature about whether it was in fact Marconi or others that preceded him in physics and electrical engineering. But for all intents and purposes, he has received that recognition for being the inventor of wireless, what was originally called wireless telegraphy, because his invention was modeled after wired telegraphy, in which a message was transmitted from one station to another station. So the initial uses of radio communication was to have one station in which an operator would send out a message and be received at a receiving station. And that could have been done between 2 points on land, or between land and a ship, or 2 ships on the waterfront. And so that produced a variety of different commercial possibilities, as well as military uses, and then eventually amateur uses for this technology. So during this early period of field emergence, there were a number of different actors that were vying for both legitimacy and authority in the field. The radio engineers had kind of that professional authority. They were coming out of established fields in physics and in electrical engineering and allied sciences. you had corporations like the one established by Marconi, who were in the business of trying to generate money and profit from this new technology. And for Marconi himself, his primarily revenue model or business model was selling the ability to transmit these messages to companies and interested consumers and leasing equipment to do that. The military also got involved. The U.S. Navy found a purpose for communicating between land and their ships, and then between ships on the open seas. Eventually, with some legislation that was passed, the Department of Commerce was the governing authority in the U.S. government, overseeing the regulations and standards of the field. And then you have the amateurs who were using the technology for fun. And then the popular media reporting on how this technology was being used, adopted, and diffused into American society. Here's just a simple graph of the number of amateurs between 1913 and 1927. As you can see, there's a general increase in the practice of this hobby, giving one simple indicator of the legitimacy of amateur radio as a hobby itself. The break between 16 and 20 represents the period in which World War I broke out, and there was a law that was passed that banned all private use of the airwaves since it was taken by the U.S. military for military purposes. So in terms of our data collection, what we wanted to do was study 4 key actors in the field and how they recognize the level of expertise of the amateurs. And what we did was we mapped that to the established set of actors that are typically studied by other institutional and legitimacy scholars, namely the state, professions, peers, and the popular media. We identified 7 relevant sources by these actors, published by these actors, and I'll get to them in the next slide. And what we did was we used the keyword-based searching protocol to identify articles written by or written about amateurs in these sources during the time period that we studied. And then this led to a sample of over 2,100 articles from these different sources. So let me go through the different sources just to give you a sense of the flavor and the range of the different actors involved. So for the radio engineers, we looked for articles in Scientific American and the IEEE, which was the kind of the professional association for the radio engineers at that time. For corporations, we used a trade publication published by Marconi, the Marconi Corporation, called Wireless Age. For the government, we have documents from the Department of Navy, the annual reports that they produced, bulletins that were published by the Department of Commerce, and then legislation that was passed by Congress to represent the government perspective. And then in terms of the public media or the popular media, we use articles from the New York Times. So given that we have a large body of textual information that we wanted to analyze, we chose a method that would automate this process. And that's a tool called LDA, which stands for Latent Dirichlet Analysis. And it's a modeling tool that allows one to take a body of text, convert that text into what are called bags of words or topics, which are formed based on words that are co-occurring within that corpus of text. And it goes through this conversion process so that in the end you have words and documents, words and topics and documents in a matrix format. It might be better to explain kind of a flow of how the data were organized or analyzed to give you a better appreciation of how this tool is used. So you have the original text, original articles that we identified in our search. Those articles are processed so that they become text files, and we take out, it goes through a cleaning algorithm, removing certain words that are high frequency but not as meaningful. And you take words in its full form and you stem them so that you have similar words but with different suffixes or prefixes identified and considered as a single word in the purpose of the analysis. And then we tag each one of those words in the documents so that each have a code. You put it through the LDA algorithm, which generates what are called topics. And these are the words that are associated with one another, and they're given a topic number. And each of those topic numbers have a probability associated with them for appearing in a particular document. That allows us to then go into the data and use the standard content analysis methods to code for first order concepts, second order themes, and eventually get to an aggregate dimension that we can use for our process modeling work. So just for a point of comparison, our study's in the middle here. We had 2,100 articles, 7 sources, in its raw form, over 2.2 million words. Eventually, after the cleaning process, there were 36,000 unique words. And then furthermore, what are called analyzed tokens, 13,000 tokens, which are the resulting word stems that remain after cleaning the original text. To put it into perspective, at the end of the day, we had 13,000 words that represented the original text of 2.2 million. So a lot of what has been said in the articles that we identified initially could be summarized in the 13,000 tokens that we used to conduct our LDA analysis. By point of comparison, the longest novel in the world by Marcel Proust is 1.2 million. That gives you a sense of kind of the range or the volume of text that we were analyzing. And then there was a similar study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences using this LDA technique. And then they were studying scientific articles and the abstracts of those articles. And then you have some information there about the process they used. They were, an order of 10x in terms of the number of different articles that they were analyzing. But in the end, the number of tokens is on par with what we concluded in our analysis. So following standard content analysis methodologies, we were conducting axial coding, which once again takes the vocabularies or the topics that were generated from the LDA model. We assign them a topic number, and then we generate these concepts and second order themes to eventually get to an aggregate dimension. And in the end, we had a range of different topics based on these second order themes. And we could also study how these themes appeared over time, because each of these articles appeared at different points in our study observation window. And that allowed us to show the process by which the legitimization occurred over time. So this leads us to kind of the main set of findings that appeared in our process model. Namely that there are 4 conditions for what we're calling lay expertise legitimation. Number 1, actors need to build an advanced collective competence. Number 2, they need to operate in an unrestricted public space. Number 3, provide transformational social contributions. And then finally, expand their original collective role identity. So what I'm going to do now is kind of walk you through our findings. And since this is an inductive historical analysis, you're not going to see regression tables in a typical deductive format, but kind of a story that we're telling based on our inductive analysis of the automated content analysis tool. And I've organized them into 2 subperiods within the larger study period. And I ask questions or puzzles that allow us to get at these different conditions. So this, I'll just give you a snapshot of what the model will look like graphically. This lay expertise alternative pathway allows those who are involved in hobbies that might be considered initially illegitimate or incompetent, making its way through the process to become eventually accomplished experts in the field. And this process, we will argue, has these synergies with the professionalization approach, that it's not done independently of it, but that there are touch points in which knowledge and professionalism and licensing occur on both sides of the model. So puzzle number one occurs in the first half of our time period. And the question that we answer is, how do these amateurs plant a lasting foothold in the professionalized field? So to kind of bring some more flavor to this question of whether the field is, I mean, we're looking back on an emergent field and making a story based on, being 100 years into the future. If we look at the historical record, the professionals were quite entrenched early on in this field. And what was puzzling from a historical standpoint is, how did these amateurs maintain some participation in this field when the professionals quickly wanted to dismiss them and move them out of the space? So this is a picture of a Marconi operator using the equipment to transmit and receive messages. And so in addition to the professional engineers, Marconi Corporation as a commercial enterprise had a vested interest in protecting the space, that they were almost kind of in partnership with the professional engineers to make sure that the amateurs were left out. And the reason for that was because the technology was in its early stages. It didn't allow for communication to take place in a crowded space. And so interference would be a big problem when you're transmitting signals when everybody was doing it at the same time. The amateurs realized that early on, and so a lot of them were troublemakers, boys and young men who got on in the middle of the night, and as these operators or the military were using it for official purposes, they would jump in and crowd out the airwaves so that all you can hear was static. And that became a big problem. This is a picture of the Titanic. Titanic sank in 1912, and the early reports came out that the Marconi operator on the ship was trying to communicate with local vessels nearby to tell them, hey, we need your help. The boat's sinking. And the message didn't apparently get out quickly enough for the closest boat, who could have saved, or who could have come to the rescue within hours, to actually do that. And so as a result, there were efforts to regulate the space, because the amateurs were accused of being the accomplices of creating the Titanic disaster, because they were unable to send the ships to rescue the passengers. So in 1912, there was a law passed, the Radio Act of 1912, the first major legislation in which the government got involved and started setting standards. And the amateurs were restricted to a very narrow band on the frequency, on the airwaves, and had to go through a standard process of getting a license. But as the headline shows from the New York Times here, the government is expected to step in and control this anarchy that's been caused by the amateurs. So again, the amateurs were not in a very favorable position from a legitimacy standpoint, because they were considered troublemakers. And here are just some quotes about how they were viewed. This first individual here, Alfred Goldsmith, was a leading radio engineer, and essentially he wanted to deny their right to operate in their usefulness, just banish them completely. Again, here's this reference to the Titanic and how the popular press wanted to accuse them, hold them responsible for this horrible disaster. But at the same time, these amateurs persevered, and they continued to meet one another in person. They created clubs. They taught each other how to use the equipment. became more and more well-versed in the technology, creating their own operating sets in their garages or their workshops using parts that they could rescue from the garbage to create these rudimentary sets. This is an example of what's called a card, a QST card, that radio operators would use to memorize or memorialize a connection that they made. So if you were a ham radio operator and you sent your signal and someone from the other part of the country received it, you would exchange your call signals and then send out this card so it's your calling card that you would send out to that other individual. It's like, you know, getting a Facebook Connect or a LinkedIn invitation, and you would respond accordingly. This is an example of what are called radio relays. This is a representation of a map of the US. And so back in the early 1900s, if you wanted to send a message from one coast to the other, you'd be using either wired telegraph or mail system. And as you can imagine, that would take a long period of time for that message to get from one end to the other. What the amateurs did was they would conduct these radio relays. So at an appointed time, they would say, okay, we are going to send a message from one side of the country to the other. And they would do a relay. Just like in a running race, one message would be sent to an operator in your city, and then from one city to another city, and that would continue and continue so that they would have a relay in place. And eventually, by the end of the 1910s, they were able to take a message from one end to the other in about 2 or 3 hours, which was remarkable for that time period, using wireless technology. That was a distinctive competence that started to emerge, that the amateurs were able to showcase to the rest of the country and to the world, in which the radio engineers, the professionals involved, did not even do themselves. In 1917, the US joined the war efforts in Europe, and so the amateurs were recruited to join and enlist as their patriotic duty. And so many did join and responded to that call and fought in battle and set up radio networks here in Europe. And so when they returned home, you would have expected that as war heroes, as someone who responded to the call for patriotic action, for those who were using their skills as hobbyists, that they should be treated with that kind of respect, that they were experts in their field. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, in 1919 and 1920, they still were not accorded that legitimacy. The US Navy still held on to power and control over the airwaves and did not want to cede it back to the amateurs. And so that leaves us with our second puzzle, the second question of why competence alone is insufficient for achieving lay expertise legitimation. And to answer this question here, it's not only about competence, but operating in a public space that's unrestricted, providing transformational social contributions, and expanding the original collective role identity. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how these three remaining conditions were met. So in 1921, the first commercial, well, I should say the first radio broadcasting station emerged in Pittsburgh called KDKE. Those were the call signals. And this was started by an amateur who realized that they could put a radio transmitter on top of I believe it was a furniture store, and they started broadcasting news and music and other kinds of content. And quickly, this concept became adopted throughout the US as a new form of communication that could be for entertainment purposes or for other purposes. But it changed the model in which the technology was used. So up until now, the main format was point to point. One operator sending, another receiving. Now you have something called point to many, so that one person or one station can broadcast to a wider audience. And the content of that broadcast could take on many forms. And so the amateurs were involved in promoting this alternative use of the technology in this space. So here's one version of how that technology was used. This is an example of a dance party, and they're listening to music, and I suppose they're dancing at the same time, or they're going to be dancing after they listen to the tunes. Here's another example of a family listening to a broadcast of entertainment, using it as entertainment in their homes. And so these last couple pictures that I'm showing you represents this movement by the amateurs to create space within the radio field to allow them to use the technologies in ways that the professionals were not using them. And that's what we're getting at with promoting this unrestricted space that the professions are not controlling directly. Right? So they were able to get the wider public to adopt this technology in ways that the professionals were not using or able to do so. They were also working with the professionals as researchers and scientists. And so this is a picture of Paul Godley, who is an amateur, alongside other radio engineers, and they're conducting these studies of how to transmit radio across the ocean. Because at that time, long-distance communications wasn't as reliable, and they were experimenting with different wavelengths. So originally it's long wave, and then eventually they were moving into short wave, and that gets into FM radio. And then they were also conducting experiments with respect to time of day. So it's easier to transmit in the evening when the atmospheric disturbances are less than during the day. And eventually they were able to transmit during the day and show how that could be done with the different technology and advancement. So they were involved with both the transmission and the equipment and other features of the technology, working alongside the professional engineers to do that. So eventually you would see headlines like this in the New York Times about the tests that they were conducting, connecting the amateurs in the US with those in Europe, and conducting these experiments to validate the advancements that they were making. As more and more of these tests were becoming successful, you soon found in the New York Times op-eds and articles written by amateurs. So Hiram Percy Maxim was the president of the American Radio Relay League, which is the amateur association that was started in 1913 for amateur radio operators. And here he's talking about how important they are, fulfilling a useful role in society. And so here are some other quotes by Maxim in the New York Times. The one that I want to point out is this one here: the amateur's apparatus has been developed on the basis of love for his work. It's not perfunctory, although skillful performance of the hired employee. Again, it's this idea of the labor of love, doing it on their own time, but yet doing it in a way that's making beneficial contributions to society, that they're transformational in both how the layperson, the general public, thinks about this technology, as well as how the professions, the scientists, are learning and advancing fundamental knowledge alongside the amateurs. And eventually our story ends. We're nearing here now the middle part of the 1920s. This individual here is Hiram Percy Maxim, sitting alongside other notables here, engineers, policymakers, and so forth. This is the International Radio Congress of 1925. They're talking about how to further standardize and regulate and use radio technology worldwide. And you can see here that an amateur is sitting alongside all these other notable officials, the elites, the professionals of the field. This is something that wouldn't have happened just 20 years ago or 20 years earlier, when they were considered incompetent and troublemakers causing a nuisance on the airwaves. So the story ends with the amateurs as field experts. The New York Times talking very highly about the role that they're playing in policy. You have several quotes about that, and then I just want to point out this one here. Remember this person here, Alfred Goldsmith. He was the one that was highly critical of the amateurs back in the early part of our time period. Now he concludes, I feel that amateurs have been unduly hampered by the wavelength restrictions which are now current. So he has now considered them and recognized them as experts and co-equals in the work that he does. Okay, so back to our professionalization model that we talked about as the dominant paradigm, and then our alternative lay expertise model here. And so I can talk a little bit now about the touch points between the two, that licensing still occurred, and it was governed by the state, but yet there was a role that the state allowed for these hobbyists to play, initially very restricted in the 1912 Original Act, but over a period of time, the amateur hobbyists played a role in actually writing the policy so that as they were being governed, they could help shape the manner in which they were being governed by the state. In terms of knowledge being controlled or opened, the professionalization pathway is much more controlled. There's a standard body of knowledge that's centrally held by the profession, whereas the lay experts, the hobbyists, the amateurs, it's a much more open environment. They were teaching one another, just like do-it-yourself communities or open source programming does right now. They're helping one another learn in clubs and other sorts of informal communities. And that self-taught competence builds on one another to the point where it affects their collective identity. That they're no longer considered to be amateurs who are incompetent. Remember that third part of the definition that we started out with, as troublemakers, incompetent, someone who's less standard in their approaches, but they are those who are experts, who can implement and carry out an activity skillfully. We talked about the role of unrestricted public space. They had the opportunity to act out and do the things that amateurs do without having the professionals squash and control their actions. And finally, and most notably, they're offering contributions that benefit society, that they stand out because they're contributing both intellectually to the scientific community as well as practically to the general public. And as a result, all of these conditions help establish the amateurs as lay experts in the field. So to kind of close this talk out, some implications in terms of field expertise, where does it come from? To summarize, professionalization is more of a top-down, centralized approach. It's all about control being held in the professions. That's kind of the dominant paradigm. What we're arguing is that there's this alternative bottom-up approach that can be also equally fruitful in leading to expertise being recognized at the field level. Other implications, with respect to identity and competence, there's this interchange between the two. And specifically, when you think about the word amateur, one could think that an amateur then becomes an expert and is no longer an amateur. So it's kind of a two-step process. What we're arguing is closer to the second definition here, that you can be both an amateur, doing it for fun, and be considered an expert at the same time, which is kind of a fusion of the identity and the competence of the two. Then lastly, there's some implications about how we think about power, especially power that's generated from and transmitted from the professions. Again, if there's this alternative pathway that doesn't depend on this jurisdiction or credentialing process, then it questions to what extent power can be held by a central profession. So I believe that's all I have in terms of my formal remarks. You've been a very attentive audience, so I'm happy to entertain questions or have conversation or further engagement about anything that I've shared so far.